Kwa ililonea jia yangu huningizia, nikamridisha atandadumisha, tameni pia. Ameniuti jia pweke ni ya furaha kwa Yesu. Ameniukati. Do you know that song? Trust and obey. There is no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust him and obey. And I learned that at a very young age. We were privileged to be with the children this morning, and I knew, even as a child, God had a special plan for me. When I was a teenager, I sensed that he wanted me to say yes to being a pastor's wife. So at the age of 17 or 18, I said yes to that. When I went to Mid-America, Nazarene College, I met Don, and he was planning to be a pastor at that time. But he wasn't real sure that was the area that God was calling him to be, but I was pretty sure that was what he was being called to be. And so we proceeded to get married, and we started our family. And, you know, sometimes God calls us as we are willing, and God calls us as we can absorb. You know, we sometimes get moved up in stages. So we had 2 girls, and he went off on a work and witness team. How many of you been on a work and witness team? I think many of you have. Just a great thing. And sometimes lives are changed on work and witness teams. So come on over to Kenya or East Africa someday. We have lots of needs there. But while he was on that team, he felt God calling him to be a missionary. And he was very willing, and he felt peaceful. He had tried on all the different hats. You know, he thought, well, maybe it's a youth worker, maybe music ministry, maybe a pastor. But he hadn't really felt settled until he heard the call to being a missionary. And so he said yes to the Lord. But he also told the Lord that he needed to talk to me, because even headquarters will say both spouses need the call. And so he came home. I sensed his call to missions, but he told the Lord he wasn't going to talk to me. You know, the Lord had to. I sensed that he had been called to missions, but I thought, no, he's just on a spiritual high. He'll come back to his senses, and will just be, you know, continuing planning to be the pastor and pastor's wife. About a year went by, and the Lord just quietly worked on my heart. One Sunday morning, we were now at Bethany, Oklahoma. He had the 11-year plan. Since we had family and all that, he had to spread out his schooling, so he was on the 11-year school plan. But we now were in Bethany, and one Sunday morning, we were at church, and the pastor was speaking about doing God's will. And he asked us 2 important questions, and I'm going to ask you to ask yourself those 2 important questions. Are you following the Lord's will for your life right now? Are you doing what God has called you to do? And so when I looked into my life, I knew I had to say yes to being a missionary. And I knew that God would help me, you know, because he never says he'll leave us. He says he'll be with us. So I went forward that morning, and I said yes to the Lord, and such a peace came over me. On the way home, I'm telling Don, I'm saying, Don, we can start a preparation for mission service. And he's driving, because he's not said anything to me. He's driving, he's looking at me. I said, watch the road, but we started then, got a hold of headquarters. They told him, get done with your schooling, get your ordination. And that's when we found ourselves in Twin Wells Indian School. And I think some of you have been to Sun Valley, now the name, Sun Valley Indian School. And I got all excited, because when we got there, I thought, wow, I became willing to be a missionary, and God is going to let me be a missionary to a different culture right here in the United States. One of the 3 of the reasons I didn't want to say yes to being a missionary is, I didn't like separation. I'm a very family-oriented person, so I didn't want to think about separation from grandparents, from the kids, from our kids. The girls going off to boarding school, which they did, or, going to university later on. which they did. Those separations, I didn't like that anxiety of that thought. I also didn't want to live in a grass hut, but we don't. You know, the fear of the unknown sometimes keeps us from answering God's call. We live in a nice home. But at that time, I was thinking, oh, I can't do grass huts. But we don't live in a grass hut. And then I just didn't feel like I was missionary material. I thought I wasn't worthy to be a missionary. But God just says, you know, he just wants our availability. Not during that time, but some years later, I came across this little saying. Someone came to the field and actually brought this little saying with them. But I'd like for you to kind of take it to some thinking this morning too. My availability gives God the opportunity to work a miracle through me. True. Can you say that? My availability gives God the opportunity to work a miracle through me. He just asks us to be available. He asks us to trust him. He asks us to obey him. And when we do, the blessings are there. We went to the field almost 25 years ago, and we took girls ages 6, 10, and 12 with us. And there was a time when I was worried that we were ruining our girls. I was homeschooling them, and they went off to boarding school, and they didn't have any culture the same that they knew. And, you know, the devil just works with our minds sometimes. And, oh, you're ruining those girls. So I was praying about it one night, and I saw a vision in my mind of huge fatherly hands and little dots in those hands. And he said to me in my praying, he says, your girls are in my hands. You just leave them there. So we've been now 25 years later, and I'm happy to report every one of them is serving the Lord. Remember my concern about being separated from family? You know, when we trust God and we obey, sometimes the blessings are just unbelievable. Our oldest daughter, when we told her we were going to the mission field, going to Africa, and that was another thing we had to trust and obey in. When we did the interviews and all that, we thought that we were going to go to a Spanish-speaking country and with his building experience and be a worker witness coordinator. So when they announced, let me back up a little bit. They said, do you have a particular call to a particular place? And we said no, wherever headquarters wanted to assign us. But I spoke up and I said, I don't think we're supposed to go to Africa, though. So I think they wrote Africa and forgot to write the no. Because when they announced Don and Evie were going to Malawi, Don leans over to me and says, where is that? And I said, they didn't say Maui. It's in Africa. So we trusted God. We prayed about it and realized it was God's will. And then we were 11 years in Malawi, and they came to us, the headquarters came to us and said, we'd like for you to consider moving to Kenya and being the field director there. And we're like, no thanks. We have no interest in moving to Nairobi. That's where our girls had gone to boarding school just outside that city. And we're not city folk, we're country folk. We grew up both in country. And we weren't interested in living in that crowded, congested city. And so we said, no thanks. But they said, no, pray about it. We think you know, that you're the ones that God has directed us to. So sure enough, after doing some praying, we knew that we had to trust God and obey in this. So we've been there now for 14 years. But I want to tell you something, you know, the blessing that I was starting to say a little bit ago. One of the reasons I didn't want to be a missionary because of separation family. And our daughter, Amy, we told her we were going to Africa, and she ran out the door, very compliant child, usually, never any issues with her. She ran out the door and said, I'm not going. And we're in the living room praying and wondering what's going to happen. And she comes back in sobbing about an hour later. Her face is all red. And she says, Mom, Dad, she says, I'm sorry. We can go to the mission field. God had just called me too. And guess what? Where Amy and her husband and 3 of our grandkids live across town, Nairobi. You know, we don't know what kind of blessings God has for us when we trust him and obey. So I want to encourage you this morning to trust God and obey. Even in Faith Promise, we thank you so much for giving to the mission field. Without your giving, we could not be there and do the work that we're doing. It pays our salary, and we just, it gives us time just to really concentrate on the work, which is going on so well. There's so many things that Jesus and God has told me to trust him and obey in ministry. Different ministries like Orphans and Vulnerable Children, Ladies Fellowships, Golf Caddy ministry, mentorship. There's just so many stories of how I've been led by the Holy Spirit to start, and not feeling adequate, but trusting him and obeying. So even as a child, when I grew up, I was encouraging the children this morning, especially as a teen, I learned to give in Faith Promise. And so I'm hoping today that you're trusting God, listening to his voice, and just doing what he is asking you to do in all things, whether it's speaking to a neighbor, doing a different job, whatever it is. Trust God and obey. There is no other way.
I may not have noticed. Oh, okay, but this is on. So, do I need to grab the other one here? Is it Breaker 19? This here's the rubber duck. You got a copy on me, Pigpen? Ephesians, in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he tells his people, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name, that he would grant you according to the riches of his glory." Imagine the riches of his glory. How much that is, how big that is. "That he would grant you according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth, and to know the love of Christ which surpasses knowledge." And catch the last phrase. This is Paul's prayer for his church. The last phrase says, "And that you may be filled up to all the fullness of God." He doesn't say that you may be filled up with a little bit of the fullness of God, but with all the fullness of God. And I think sometimes we're afraid to allow God to fill us up with all of his fullness. We're talking about holiness here. We're talking about sanctification, being filled up with God. And I think sometimes we are afraid to allow God to fill us up with all of his fullness because he might require something of us that we're not willing to do. And it is with great pleasure that I stand before you this morning to be able to share some of what God is doing in Africa. My greatest desire, I shared last night, my greatest prayer for the church is that God would fully overcome his church with the Holy Spirit. That God's Holy Spirit would overcome us and enable us as a church to really be who he would have us to be. And I believe that God is doing that throughout different parts of Africa. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Ethiopia, and I had opportunity. I have this little notebook here that I carry around with me everywhere, and I had opportunity to take some notes as we were listening to some of our church leaders in Ethiopia. These leaders come from the underground church, and if you don't know what the underground church, that is where we have churches where it is illegal to be a Christian. And the underground church, I can't tell you where these churches are or what country they're in. Otherwise, we'd have to line you up and shoot you all or something for having all the knowledge. But in actuality, I will mention a country or two where we have underground churches. And I might mention a name or so today. But those names are so common. They're like Smith and Jones here, and and David and George, and that we have here in the U.S. So nobody would ever be able to trace who it is, and I trust you all anyway. But we had opportunity to meet with some of our leaders, and I really wanted to hear how God was working in them and how God was using them. I wanted to really understand from them how God was using them in the church, how they were organizing the church in order to keep the church safe in these underground countries. In Somalia, we have so many churches and so many leaders in the church. We really don't even know how many we have. And it's because of the way it's structured. And I'll come to that in just a little bit. But I wanted to talk a little bit today about two young ladies. Both of them are named Hani, Hani. I spelled it because I don't want you to think I have a couple of honeys over there in Africa. But Hani, Hani, both of them have the same name. Both of them are refugees from Somalia who are now living in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. Hani the elder, we'll call her because she's older than Hani the younger. Hani the elder is 31 years old. She has two children, and she lives with her mother and her two sisters in this camp. Her father had been killed because of his faith in Somalia, in Mogadishu. And when he was killed, they fled to Ethiopia for the safety of their family, and Hani and her children. They live in the refugee camp, and here's Hani's words. She said, "It is difficult. It is violent here. If we are caught," she said, it is almost 100% Muslim people in this camp, all Somali Muslims. And she said, if they catch us listening to Christian broadcasts or reading anything or listening to Christian preaching, she said they will cut off our ears. And she said that she met Hani the younger in the camp as a refugee, and she led Hani to the Lord, Hani the younger. But she found Jesus through her mom and because of her father's faith, and that was how she came to know the Lord. She said, in the camp there are no freedom, there are no resources, there's no resources to travel, and the way that they get money to travel from about 3 or 4 hour bus ride from where the camp is to where our Bible college is, where we met them, the way they get money is that they will save some of their food back and then sell that food so they'll have a few coins for bus fare. And they will then get on the bus and come to the Bible college, the two Hanis together. And she said that they worship there in what she called a house church. And they have 7 other ladies that come and worship with them, and they worship on Friday afternoon because that's when all the Muslims go to the mosque and go to prayer, and that's when they're the safest and less chance of anyone finding them worshiping. She said, but when they worship, I need to describe for you what they actually live in. The way she described it is just cloth stretched over sticks. That's the tent that they live in. And they put a cloth on the ground because the ground is all sand. In that area where the camp is, there are no trees, there are no shrubs, there is no grass. It is just sand desert in Ethiopia. It's the southern part of the southern part and eastern part of the Sahara Desert. And she said that they worship in that tent. Now, you know how thin the walls of a tent can be and how people can hear anything through those walls, if you call them walls, through the cloth. And she said, so what they do is that they will play music really loud and turn it up loud. And then while they are playing that music, then they will worship quietly so that their worship is masked by the music that is playing loud, and then people outside can't hear exactly what they're doing. While they're worshiping, Hani's mom will sit out front with her laundry basket and basin, and will be doing laundry out in front of the tent so she can keep an eye out in case anybody comes. And if she sees anybody coming, Hani's mother will stand up and run into the tent and say, "Hani, your phone is ringing." Yeah, Hani has a phone. You can get them in Africa really cheap. You can get a smartphone for about $50, although it's not very smart. It still works. But she said that that is the signal. When her mom says, "I hear your phone ringing," that is a signal they stop the worship and they'll pick up their sewing and embroidery and just be sitting there as ladies doing what ladies do in Africa, sewing and embroidery and other things that have to be done. 1 year ago, Hani started coming to our Bible college, the two Hanis together. And when they started coming to the Bible college, they began to learn. Both of them want to be pastors. And when they began to learn the things that we have to teach and train them in order for them to become ordained in the church of the Nazarene. And they want to be better equipped. And so they come to the Bible college, and when they come to the Bible college, they'll spend approximately a week there. We have to have 40 hours of teacher-student contact. They'll spend about a week there, and then they will go back to the camp. And Hani was telling us that they have 7 young women in that camp that are their congregation, and when they take the Bible college course, they have to reteach it in order to get credit for the course. I mean, this is part of the way that we are building additional leaders, and we want to train up as many leaders as we can, as fast as we can, because we lose so many in Somalia. We lose approximately 8 pastors every year in Somalia who are killed for their faith. They're hunted down and killed. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But she said that they are reteaching, and they have 7 women in their discipleship group in their house church. And she said that she and her mom have applied for refugee transfer status in order to come to the United States so they can worship as they would like to. And she still wants to be a pastor to Somali people here in the U.S. Now, Hani the Younger is, when Hani the Elder leaves, Hani the Younger will become the pastor. And Hani the Younger is 16 years old. And she loves the Lord with all of her heart. And we were able to let her tell us her story and how they are organized there in the camp. And she was explaining to us all of the things that are going on in her life. But she said that she lives with her mom and her brother, her family. She has a couple of sisters. Her mother and her family are all Muslim. And she said she gets a lot of persecution just from her family. And she told us that when she comes for the Bible college courses and then takes the courses, returns back to the camp, that her brother and her mother will beat her every single time. And then she said to us, we asked her, well, why do you keep coming to the Bible college if you're beaten every time? You know you're going to be beaten. And she said to us, it is worth it to know better how to serve my Jesus. She said, I learn more about my faith when I come to the Bible college. I learn more how to train others when I come to the Bible college. And she said, when they beat me, it's okay. It's worth it. And she said to us, I know that when I return today, after this meeting, that they will beat me again. And she said to us that we have a Somali saying, she said, in the Somali language, when someone beats you up, there is still part of your body remaining. And she said, I will use whatever part of my body remains to share Jesus with everyone I know. And she said, it's worth it to know better how to serve Jesus. As we were leaving that day and saying our goodbyes, the Somali people are very huggy people, and so these 2 young ladies had come and taking their turns to give us hugs to say goodbye. And when I put my arms around Hani the Younger, I could feel the scars on her back from where she had been beaten. Her brother will often beat her with a steel rod, and Hani the Elder tells us that sometimes Hani is unable to get out of bed for a week because of the beatings that she's taken. But she still wants to go and be the pastor of this church. And she said that she has a desire that one day peace will come to Somalia, and she'll be able to go back to Somalia and spread Christ wherever she goes. God uses whoever is available. Then also I received some emails just very recently on March the 14th. I received this email. Pastor Sharif, 38 years old. This took place on 24th of February 2015. The pastor was home alone when Islamic gunmen pulled him out of his living room. This is in Somalia. Pulled him out of his living room, drug him into the center of the village, into the marketplace, and shot him there in the village square, chanting Allahu Akbar, which means Allah is great. And one of the gunmen read a sermon over the martyr's body, alleging that Allah will reward the killers with paradise since they had killed an apostate from Islam. This happened just not very far from Mogadishu. Then after they had killed him, they returned to his home and they looted everything that was valuable. Then they burned the house down. His wife of 5 years, his two daughters, aged 1 and aged 3, they survive him, and they are now hiding in the Somali capital, Mogadishu. Our church in Mogadishu is hiding them. He was badly wounded, this same pastor, in 2006. He was badly wounded after the Islamic people sprayed bullets into his house church while he was preaching. And he was shot 8 times, but he still survived that shooting. This time they deliberately took him out to shoot him in front of the village in order to warn everyone else not to become Christians. That's one email. That was on the 14th of March. And I received another email on the 18th of March. This one is Pastor Mohammed. He's 51 years old. And he was riding on a bus coming back to Mogadishu from north of Mogadishu, another town up there. He had been in that other town teaching discipleship to some of our pastors and some of our lay people, and doing a discipleship class. And he was an amazing discipler. And according to eyewitnesses, and also Bob Sasson appeared to know which bus the pastor was riding in. And so when the bus arrived in Mogadishu, the assassin boarded the bus before anyone could disembark. He asked for anyone by this pastor's name, and he identified himself, not realizing that he was in trouble. And they took him off of the bus, and when he stepped onto the ground, they shot him 4 times through the heart and killed him. This pastor was arrested just last December in 2014 because a local Muslim businessman accused him of converting the businessman's son to Christianity. And when he was brought before the judge, the pastor denied the charges and said that the young man in question decided on his own to follow Jesus. And he was released 12 days later. And it is amazing how God is using these men and women. His wife, since he's been killed, his wife with 4 children have gone into hiding for security reasons, and they are in Mogadishu, being hidden and cared for by our church there in Mogadishu. This is another one that I just received on April the 10th, and Pastor Jama, 31 years old, was returning home from a prayer meeting in Mogadishu, and when he was accosted by an assailant who pointed his handgun at his chest, pulled the trigger twice, and the gun failed to go off, and the assailant ran away, afraid. And God still has something for this pastor. He ran away afraid. Then he called the pastor later, found his phone number, and called him to intimidate him, and was accusing him of converting Muslims to the Christian faith. The pastor reported the incident to the police, handed over the phone number that showed up on his cell phone, and they've now arrested that attacker, and he's in prison. He's in jail. Now, this pastor is hiding in fear for his life, and the church in Mogadishu is keeping him safe. Why do I tell you these stories? I tell you these stories not to create some kind of sensationalism, but this is where these people live. I tell you these stories because we need to understand that Jesus can use any of us at any time, at any place, and he wants us to be totally filled with his Holy Spirit that we might be better used of him. And these pastors' wives that have survived, and we've even lost some women pastors in the same manners. And what we're trying to do to help them is to help them to establish. They've asked that we could help them to start chicken farms or something like that, and so we're trying to assist them to start some chicken farms. We can do that for about $3,500 for each one. That includes getting the land and the building and fencing and things set up, and chickens to start, and all the food and things to start the first cycle of raising chickens. But I want you to understand what's happening with these is that our local churches in Somalia, in our underground, not just in Somalia, but our local churches in the underground church, are organized in very different ways than what they are anywhere else in the world, as far as I know. The pastor may have anywhere from 2 to 10, even 20 cell groups that he works with. And these cell groups will average in membership from maybe 10 to 15 to 20 people per group. But this cell group, will never know the members of this cell group. And they have the same pastor. He's the only one who knows everybody. And we do that because if any of these people are arrested or are captured and tortured for their faith, they are unable to identify anybody else outside of their cell group. And that is for their own protection. But when a pastor is killed, remember I told you that when they take their Bible college courses, they go back and they reteach it? Our pastors are teaching it to every member in the church, every member in that cell group. They're reteaching the courses. And so those people will get their Bible college education in their local church. And because of that teaching and training, there are always people within each cell group who rise up saying that they are called by God to preach the gospel and to become pastors. So when we lose a pastor, here's what happens. These cell groups will divide and scatter, where there are maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people in the group, or maybe even less. And they'll scatter, but wherever they go, they scatter into groups where they have at least one who has been trained. And that one who has been trained now becomes the pastor of that cell group, that new cell group, and they will grow. And the church, this is what's happening, is that out of a group of maybe 10 cell groups, we might have 25 or 30 new cell groups every time we lose a pastor. And God is growing his church. Even though it's sad that we're losing the pastors, God is bringing victory and raising up his church, even in the persecution. God knows how to win his own battles. And when these guys have even, assassinated a pastor, they've even taken videos of the killings and will send that video by message text, to every phone in Somalia and to every phone in Ethiopia, and then, with a Muslim prayer and everything going on with it, and the video of the assassination, and their purpose is to discourage anybody. It's a threat and a discouragement to anybody to become a Christian. But you know what? It's having the opposite effect. Because what's happening is that as people witness these murders on a video, I've seen 2 or 3 of them now, and every single one of these videos, on the pastor's face, there is no fear. There's anxiety, perhaps, but there's no fear. And when people see someone dying without fear for Jesus Christ, when they know that they will die when they accept him, people are being drawn to Jesus. And they will find some way. We are receiving almost on a I wouldn't say a daily basis, but 2 or 3 times a week, we're receiving emails and things, phone calls occasionally from people who are finding Jesus because of these killings, and they are trying to find out, how can I be trained? And before we can even really answer them, we have to screen who they are, because we can't expose any of our trainers to people that we don't know. But God is helping us to know who is who and how to do that.